So the research that I'm presenting today has its roots in a kind of academic treasure hunt of sorts. I've been researching modernism and taste for a little while when I came across this reference on the Postal Museum and Archive website. And I hope you can see it because I seem to have done the writing a little bit small, but I'll read the pertinent sentence out, which is, Kenneth Clarke, its chairman, commented later on the aim to raise the level of public taste, and I've highlighted that phrase there because it really piqued my interest. As a modernist scholar, I spend a lot of my time looking at prototypes and manifestos and kind of theoretical engagements with the public, but it's very rare that we actually see modernists physically getting engaged on a public engagement project. And so what interested me about the post office was that they did have this board of advisors, they did produce posters, and the project came to fruition. So I wanted to try and find out a little bit more about this quote, so I did some Googling, couldn't find anything. And I got Kenneth Clarke's 2-volume autobiography, and it's quite dull, I can say. But again, no references really to the GPO in there. So this is on the Postal Museum and Archive website, so I got in touch with them, having kind of bemoaned the fact that they didn't actually reference the quote properly. And they were very kind and looked it up for me, and it actually comes from a letter, an unpublished letter, which was written by Kenneth Clarke in 1937. And he was writing to the head of the Poster Advisory Committee, which I'm going to talk about later, in order to tender his resignation. So you can imagine that if this little quote had piqued my interest, then the idea of him resigning in this kind of big formal resignation letter made me even more interested. So off I went down to London and did some research at the Postal Archive for a few days. So what I'm going to talk about today is the fruits of that labour. It was my first time working with minutes, so I thought it was going to be very dull and very boring, but actually what I found was some intrigue, some conflict, all kinds of disagreements about aesthetics. There was kind of behind-the-scenes wrangling, confidential investigations, all kinds of amazing stuff which was happening. And it occurred to me that the General Post Office can be seen as a microcosm of many of the debates which were occurring more widely during this period. In particular, the conflict between art and commerce, between the avant-garde and more traditional forms of art, and also this relationship between modernism and the public's relation to modernism. So before I go into the GPO itself, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about this wider impulse to improve the public taste in the 1920s and 30s. And I'm aware as I'm saying this that Dan's just written a book on this, so I'm sure he can tell us more later. But when I thought about this impulse to improve the public taste, I immediately thought of the BBC, which was set up in 1922, and was really shaped by its first chairman, Lord Reith, and his famous statement that output should educate, inform, and entertain in exactly that order. In publishing, you had the new classic libraries, so there were cheap reprints coming out of literary fiction in paperback, bringing literature to the masses. Faber and Faber, in particular at this time, were committed to introducing the public and educating them about modern art. In particular, Herbert Reed had a series of books on modern art and industry and sculpture and this kind of thing. As early as 1909, the popular writer and critic Arnold Bennett wrote Literary Taste and How to Form It, which was a kind of early how-to guide to developing a discerning attitude towards literature. Similarly, popular magazines were also moving into this area, and one example being Vanity Fair's modern portfolio of French art. And this is a remarkable thing. It's from 1935, and it's these really high-quality plates produced in this booklet for its readers to either display or kind of educate them more widely about art. There were popular travelling exhibitions that toured locations not usually exposed to modern art, and the most famous of which was probably the 1938 tour of Picasso's Guernica, which ended up in all sorts of unlikely locations, such as an old garage. So this wasn't a new impulse. We can see this desire to improve the masses right throughout the 18th century and beyond. In particular, I'd looked to Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy from 1868, but the issue seemed to take on more urgency in the immediate post-war period. In particular, the issue of memorialisation brought these aesthetic debates into sharp focus. I've been doing some research recently with the London Mercury, a journal from the early 20s, and they talked a lot in there about the form that the medals should take for the veterans of the First World War. And so it seemed to take on a particular importance, this notion of really producing design which honoured the men who'd been so brave in that conflict. So although it was pronounced across culture, I'd like to argue that this belief in the power of design was the most pronounced in this emerging field of graphic design. During the 1920s and 30s, organisations such as London Underground, Shell Met, which was Shell Petrol, and all four railway companies, that's LNER, LNS, GWR and Southern, they were all working with leading artists and graphic designers to produce exceptionally modern, daring designs. And you've probably seen some of them, but I've got a few of my favourites here. Austin Cooper's designs for London Underground from 1924. I love the fact that he's just used geometric shapes and differences in colour, different gradations of colour, to indicate the coolness on one side and the warmness on the other. Edward Midnight Calfer, he's my favourite. This is one of his designs for Shell from 1923, part of a series. And you can see the emerging influence of Cubism in some of the graphic design from this period, and also the use of strong contrasting colours. Tom Purvis for LNER, really expressionist, kind of fauvist use of colour, and the simplified shapes really make it very striking. William Sennett, slightly later, a bit more of an Art Deco design. And as somebody from Somerset, I can attest that Weston-super-Mare is definitely not as glamorous, but it's a beautiful place there nonetheless. And these two striking ones for Southern Railway, Edmund Vaughan in the middle there, he's largely forgotten, but his design, I think, is really kind of was constructivist in its design, with the kind of the fractured sunbeams coming through. And on the right, Charles Shepherd, the golden arrow, really conveying the kind of modernity, the speed, the dynamism of the railways, which was something that P. Owen Brown also tried to represent for his LMS poster from 1930. And so they're really trying to kind of redefine this idea of railway travel as something very modern, something very fast and dynamic. So those are a few examples, but other prominent figures included John and Paul Nash, Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, Revilius, Edward Borden, Graham Sutherland, John Piver, and Man Ray, who also did a design for London Underground. Such places were heralded by the newly established Design and Industries Association as exemplary instances of the possibilities of modern graphic design. Individuals such as Frank Pick, who was the head of publicity at London Transport, really believed that they could improve the lives of the public by exposing them to the latest ideas through design. They felt that good design could make the public's lives easier. It would help them move more easily through the city, boost productivity, and even raise their spirits. For Pick, it was not just a case of producing better posters or more legible maps, both of which he did, but of completely transforming the urban space, and in doing so, in helping mankind reach its true potential. All of which brings us back to the General Post Office in the early 1930s. Unlike the Underground or the railways, the Post Office had always been very suspicious of advertising. Mike Barden has written a book about the GPO called GPO Posters, post-early 1920 to 1960. And in it, he describes the organisation's approach to advertising in the 1920s. The company sold advertising space on the back of vans in offices and on pillar boxes to the UK Advertising Company in 1920. But the organisation as a whole was very reluctant to actually advertise post office products. Barden quotes this wonderful internal memo of 1925, which encapsulates his position. It's quite long, but I'm just going to read it if you don't mind, because I think it's fantastic. The telegraph service is so old established and so ubiquitous that everybody who is capable of sending a telegram must be assumed to know that he can telegraph whenever it is worth his while to do so. Hence, the object of advertisement would be, broadly speaking, to persuade people to send telegrams which is not worth their while to send. We are used to the art of psychological suggestion for the purpose of inducing people to waste money in a particular way. The way itself, that is telegraphing, is a blameless one. And it's no doubt much better than many ways in which people waste their money, whether with or without the stimulus of advertisement. But a government service may be expected to have regard to other considerations than that of diverting as much money as possible into its own pockets. And so what I really like about this quote is its kind of very old-fashioned sense of morality and indignation at this idea that the government could actually be making any money out of its citizens. It's kind of funny when we think about the post office today and renewing a driving licence or anything like that. But they continued this remarkable attitude towards advertising right throughout the 1920s. They wouldn't take advertising space away from the commercial advertisers because they didn't think that advertising would lead to an increase in their sales. They seemed to think that the market for posting was actually saturated already, and thus there would never be any need to advertise. So despite the extraordinary campaigns being run by some of the commercial companies I've shown you, the GPO stood firm in its indifference to advertising. Another model began to assert itself, however, in the form of the Empire Marketing Board. And this was a government department which was set up in 1926, and it produced posters, pamphlets, exhibitions, lectures, radio talks, and school visits, all with the aim of educating the public about the products that the Empire produced. Although it was set up in order to increase sales and to improve trade, the primary focus of much of its output was educational. When the board finally closed in 1933 due to funding cuts, its secretary and head of publicity, Sir Stephen Tallents, moved to the GPO to become the first head of publicity there. And this is him, Sir Stephen Tallents. You can just about see him. So as far as I can gather then, upon joining the GPO, Tallents went about setting up a poster advisory group. So there was already a publicity committee within the GPO, but Tallents was very keen to get external advisors involved when it came to the design and commissioning of posters. So we're going to see later, the facts get a little bit shaky as to what happened, but it seems that in late 1933, Tallents had a number of informal lunches with some of the leading figures from the art world, including Bloomsbury critic Clive Bell, then director of the National Gallery and later television art critic Kenneth Clark, and finally Jack Beddington, who was the head of publicity at Shell. We don't know what was discussed at these meetings, but it was when recording these meetings in 1937 that Clark made his famous statement. And this is the one that I set off on this kind of treasure hunt to find. So he says, when Tallents first asked me to go on the poster committee, I agreed to do so because he told me that the post office wished to follow the example of the Empire Marketing Board and such firms as London Transport and Shell Met, and issue a series of posters which would bring real credit to the institution and raise the level of public taste. I was told that these posters would be sent to thousands of schools and would form the decoration of the hundreds of post offices springing up all over the country. It seemed to me a national enterprise of great importance, and I could see no reason why a policy should not succeed. So although he's speaking 4 years later, we can only assume that this is what him, Bell and Beddington discussed with Tallents when forming the poster advisory group. And I think it's quite extraordinary to think about now that the fact that a kind of a small little committee in the post office actually featured so many of the leading art critics and theorists of the day. It was kind of a small celebrity group, I suppose. For Tallents and his a bit unofficial advisors then, the purpose of the group was to help the post office raise the standard not only of its posters, but also the taste of the viewing public as well. So in early 1934, the group had been officially formed. It comprised of Tallents, along with a number of post office employees, including John Grierson, the documentary filmmaker, and Alexander Hyatt, who was a key figure in the publicity department, along with Bell, Beddington and Clark. The group in this formation was short-lived. Tallents left the post office for the BBC in 1935. But the minutes that survive from these 2 years provide a record of how and why posters were commissioned. And this is actually very rare when you're looking at design during this period. It's very hard to find out why they chose such avant-garde designs, so it's really interesting to see this. They give an insight into the workings of the department, trying to grapple this really emerging notion of brand identity, and of some vanguard individuals battling with their more traditional counterparts. So, as we saw in Clark's quote, one of the key aims of the group was to produce designs for circulation in schools. Before the group first met in May 1934, one series had already been commissioned, and it's these ones by Harold Sandys Williamson. This was the first series of posters for schools, and I think you can just about make them up there. They're fairly modern, they're fairly pleasing, but if you consider them in relation to some of the ones we saw earlier, they're clearly a lot more traditional. They're quite realist in their depiction, especially at the ship and the kind of shipyard at the top there. I'm not sure that they completely work as posters, especially when you see them at this distance and quite small. They're not really that striking. The colours are quite muted. Even the most modern of the designs, which is this one with the airplane, you can tell the period from the neoclassical building in the background and from the design of the plane, but he seems to miss a trick here because he's featuring a plane and, you know, it's so modern and so fast and dynamic, and yet he's featured it just sitting on the runway there. So it kind of seems a bit of a staid, traditional representation, and you consider even the railways that we saw before were so dynamic, and the plane would have gone faster, but here it's quite boring. So I included these images because I wanted to draw a contrast with the first series, which was commissioned by the Poster Advisory Group. And these were these ones by John Armstrong. And I think that even just a brief comparison shows you that these were a lot more daring and a lot more modern. They're beginning to use ideas of abstraction. You can still tell what they're about, but they're kind of using these simplified shapes. There's a kind of truncated perspective, especially on this medieval one here. And they do make references to the past, but they've done so in such a kind of stylized, modern way that you have no doubt as to the period in which they were produced. I like his use of texture. I don't know if you can see, but it's actually oil on wood. So he's created this really nice kind of tactile texture, especially on the top one of the vase there, and kind of creating a woodcut effect without actually producing a woodcut. And again, the colour scheme, very bold, very striking, a use of a four-colour scheme with the orange accents really bringing out the detail. My favourite one is this one, and I think if you consider that these were posters going out to schools, this is a really clever design because the poster looks kind of really cool in sunglasses there, and you can imagine school children actually getting really quite interested and excited about the post office with this very kind of dynamic postman. And this poster is also interesting because it tells us a little bit about the commissioning process during this time. The Poster Advisory Group had suggested that this poster should feature a travelling post office, but the artist, John Armstrong, said that it was unsuitable, and so he suggested a road motor subject instead, and this is what he came up with. So this is just one instance of the licence that was given to artists by this committee. They gave them a rough brief, but really as long as it was of a high artistic standard, they weren't really too bothered about what the poster was actually depicting. Their discussions about aesthetics far outnumber any references made to the design's educational value, or even to their value as sources of information or as advertising. Talents and his advisors seem largely uninterested in the more commercial aims of the posters produced, and consequently the focus of the minutes is on the commissioning and the display of the posters. And in the minutes there were pages and pages and pages about the type of frames that were going to be used for the posters. They really thought down to every single detail, types of frames, height on the wall, the distribution, etc. And they felt that it would be, and I quote, wiser to refer to a well-hung picture gallery rather than a private home for suggestions as to the way in which posters should be hung. So for them, posters were not just means of graphic communication, they were works of art. These were prestige posters, as opposed to anything of a direct advertising character. They were not intended to sell the public products, but rather, and it's another quote, to be hung so as to add to the amenities of the office or room in which they are exhibited. Once again, then, we return to this utopian notion that posters would improve the public simply by being displayed, albeit properly, in their workspaces. There's an emerging sense of talents in his non-official colleagues viewing the post office as some kind of Bauhausian Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, a kind of huge canvas onto which to project their vanguard ideas about the best modern design practices. They considered every detail of the post office, down to the very paint colour used on their walls, in order to ensure uniformity and a sense of brand identity, which carried across the post office in the public spaces, the offices, promotional material, and moving display spaces. This notion of creating a homogeneous brand identity was really quite radical in the 1930s. Although Frank Pick was attempting something similar with London Underground, it had never been attempted in a government office before. So to ensure that the posters were properly displayed and interpreted by the post office staff, Talents drew up several memorandums for distribution to both head postmasters and the surveyors responsible for hanging the posters. Discussing the former, he wrote, "I expect it will be desirable to issue to head postmasters some sort of note on this subject, explaining that they must not expect in news posters either photographic accuracy or the type of design which you see on the hoardings or on chocolate boxes." So he goes on to say that he feels that if there was any art criticism which was written about the posters, then he should distribute it to all of the head postmasters for them to understand the kind of high artistic aims of the posters, and then to feed it down through their staff. You can imagine what the head postmasters would have thought about that. Before talents could educate the public then, he felt that he had to educate his staff, and in particular the surveyors who were going to hang the posters. He writes, "The posters will not, of course, have any direct selling appeal. Their function is to decorate and to add to the amenities of public offices." And he goes on, second paragraph, "As already indicated in various publications, endeavour is being made to secure designs of a high artistic standard by the employment of well-known artists on the advice of a small panel of experts." And he repeats this phrase that he's written before, "And neither photographic accuracy nor the type of design seen on the poster hoardings or on chocolate boxes need be expected. Further information will be issued later." And I've highlighted the "of course" here because to me that seems the most telling phrase in the whole memorandum. If you think about the surveyor to an outsider, if you've been hanging posters which were trying to sell products for the last 20 years, and then if he gets these posters in which are not actually selling but are just kind of enhancing the space in some kind of way, you can imagine his surprise, frankly, at displaying such posters. The problem is, though, that Talents, with his "of course," adopts a fairly patronising, quite imperious tone, which displays a disconnect with the vast majority of his colleagues. And I think it goes some way to explaining why he's constantly reiterating this high artistic standard and how they're not going to be realist and they're not going to be photographic. He's really kind of trying to defend himself all of the time against any objections. So what we see here then is a divide emerging between the artistic and the commercial. And this was a divide which was a stalwart of modernist criticism during this period and previously as well. So it's not surprising that it emerges in this enclave of vanguard advisors and idealists. What is surprising, though, is the extent to which these divisions were upheld. In 1934, the group produced two lists of potential poster artists, and they divided them into the categories pictorial and selling. Where the former list contained 40 names, the selling list contained only 5. And I think these numbers alone demonstrate where the priorities of the committee lay. They seem to demonstrate a modernist squeamishness for anything considered remotely commercial. In his correspondence, Talents was at pains to assure contacts in the art world that it was a type of public work which no artist need disdain. He says they were looking for work of real quality, not merely advertising material. And again, it's this word "merely," it's suggesting that real quality could not be advertising material. So there's this real split between art and commerce. They did produce some work of a frankly advertising type, but even then they ensured that the commissioning display of such posters was severely restricted. In his memorandum to surveyors later on, he writes, "It is regarded of vital importance that every effort should be made to avoid crowding the walls of post offices, either with posters or with other announcements." He kind of wants to make it like, a lovely white wall on which you can display his posters like in an art gallery. The display of selling posters will therefore be restricted to occasions when the department wishes to announce important reductions in rates or in the introduction of new facilities and services. So the selling posters are the exception, not the rule. They seem to regard it as a necessary evil which has to be borne only in order to get back to the work of producing these lovely pictorial posters. Yet the division that they imposed between the two types of artists was not clear. In general, the selling artists were graphic designers and the pictorial artists were fine artists, but they found it difficult to characterise those who worked in both fields. And that was quite hard because most of the artists who were working at that time also did commercial work for various different companies. Names shifted between the lists meeting to meeting, so often they thought they were pictorial and then they were selling and vice versa. And some names appeared on both lists, such as Edward Midnight Cowper. Nevertheless, they still persevered with this system of characterisation, And I find this strange because when we look back at the GPO today, to me anyway, it seems like they really challenge the art-commerce or high-low divide by commissioning artistic designs for popular consumption. And yet, the very people who were commissioning those designs were very interested in upholding these distinctions. So I think this is a kind of useful reminder which gets to the heart of definitions of art during this period. It simply could not, for these men, be artistic if it was at the same time commercial. Ironically, though, when we compare the pictorial and selling posters today, it's the selling posters which have more aesthetic appeal. So, these are a couple of the pictorial posters, and I think they're both quite pleasant, but they're not that striking. The Graham Sutherland, I think, is more successful. He's got this kind of abstract kind of paint wash effect in the background and some fairly bright colours. But if you look at the postman himself, he's kind of fairly traditional, he's slightly, not too painterly, but there is quite a lot of detail there. There's even addresses on the envelopes, which you wouldn't have been able to see at a distance. I think the typography there is really doing a lot of the work. The John Nash one, I mean, this is the artwork for rural postmen, and this suggests that the poster was never actually used, and you can probably see why, because you can't really see how it would fit as a poster in a post-early campaign. There's a little bit too much detail there, the colours are too muted, there's a sort of faded image of a village in the background, and it just doesn't really have the clout of some of the earlier posters that we saw. In contrast, we want to show you a few of the selling posters. These were commissioned for advertising new services. So one was the home telephone, and the other was airmail. So I think when you compare those to those, they're a lot more modern, the selling posters, a lot more striking. They really work as posters, something to be seen from a distance, and a simple message clearly communicated. I like these posters because of their use of the colour palette, the white, the black and the blue with a little bit of red accent. And even though they're designed by different designers, there's a kind of sense of coherency to them used through this colour palette. They're quite idiosyncratic at the same time. The Thoroughly Elliott one at the bottom, he also produced very similar designs for London Underground. He did all of these sort of abstract charts. This one's saying that effectively more people used airmail. I don't think it's scientifically accurate in any way, but it looks very nice. And he did one similar for the Underground, a similar chart promoting the electrification of different lines. So you can tell it's his, but at the same time the use of the blue does give it a kind of airmail post office feel. The other ones, I think, are even more coherent. They all use this central graphic image, and then around it the asymmetric sans serif lettering in diagonals. And this was a style that was very popular during the late 30s and 40s in graphic communications and posters. But it was quite early to see this style adopted, so the GPO were quite avant-garde in their approach here. And especially like the Edward McKnight Calfa, because it shows the developing language of graphic design. So the fact that he's used the kind of world as the head with the telephone to it, it communicates the fact that you can contact anybody in the world with the telephone really simply and effectively, and you almost don't even need to have the words there, you can still get the message. And that was something that happened throughout the 40s, was that the words increasingly were removed often, and then you just had the graphics telling the story. So although these posters were avant-garde, they actually met with broad approval at the GPO, and I think probably because they communicate their message so well that one could hardly object to them, even if they are quite daring. The problem was, though, when they tried to use avant-garde aesthetics in the pictorial posters. The trouble started as early as the group's third meeting in July 1934, when they discussed a rough design for the interior of a post office in a market town by Mr. Payne. And the disagreement is recorded in the minutes as follows. Mr. Clark said that the design was harmless and without vice, but was not a work of art such as the group was aimed at producing. Mr. Hyatt said that the subject would appeal to members of the post office staff, and that the design would serve as a foundation for a bridge between conventional posters and more advanced designs. The design that they're discussing no longer survives, unfortunately, but I think that this exchange is of great interest. It's very polite, very diplomatic, but the minutes do seem to belie a developing fault line between the non-official advisors and the GPO staff. Whereas Clark and Beddington are only interested in aesthetics, Beddington says he thought that the artist had not made a success of his attempt. Hyatt's clearly worried about alienating his staff, and Hyatt is the GPO's actual employee. He doesn't raise objections to the more advanced designs, but his was a more pragmatic approach, one which realised that it was necessary to ease staff perhaps more gently into appreciating avant-garde design. And I think Clark's suggestion at the bottom that they should bring in a more distinguished painter to commission a design really misses the point, because I don't think Hyatt's objecting to the way that the poster's being designed, but rather he actually quite likes the fact that it's traditional and perhaps not as avant-garde as some of the other posters. So again, we have this notion of Clark and the unofficial advisors are taking a very modernist, kind of patrician attitude towards the public. Clark, as this man of great taste and of great standing, is not really interested in what the ordinary man wants, but rather in what is good for him. And this emerging fault line, which we can see here, deepened further after Talents left in 1935. As we've seen, he really was the driving force behind the modernisation of the post office. He was the crucial link between the GPO staff and the other non-official advisors, managing to unite both, however, uneasily. His enthusiasm and real belief in the power of design, not only to improve lives in some kind of vague utopian way, but also to actually change habits and improve productivity, won in support from both the avant-garde and his superiors within the GPO. And the early poster which we saw earlier, and that was one of a series, was actually his idea, because he felt that if you could get the public through design to post their letters earlier, then it would mean that the post office could kind of extend their work throughout the day rather than it all being in the last hour of the day. So he felt that it was a more productive way for the post office to conduct itself. Upon his departure, however, Talents was replaced by one Colonel Crutchley. And here he is. He looks as you imagine Colonel Crutchley to look. And he was a man with a singular dislike of modern art and a distrust of artists in general. And I practiced this presentation with my husband, and he said he was like the pantomime villain of the piece, and I think that's a fair comment. The appointment seems to have been a strategic one to counter Clark's increasing influence on the commissioning process. Almost as soon as he took over, Crutchley gave Hyatt responsibility for commissioning designs, and he relegated the role of the poster advisory group to a purely advisory one. Crutchley himself began sitting in on the group meetings, seemingly to try and wrestle back control of the commissioning process from Clark and Beddington. He flooded the group with other post office employees, presumably to outnumber the unofficial advisors. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before disagreements arose. In particular, the disagreement revolved around this picture, and this was Vanessa Bell's artwork for a poster called The Last Minute. Trouble began in September 1936 when Beddington remarked that he'd only seen 7 of the approved designs actually on display in the post office, and by this stage he'd approved many dozens. Crutchley tried to fob him off, but could not answer Beddington's specific question about when the last minute would be used. Crutchley promised to speak to the Postmaster General, but when Beddington inquired again about the last minute in February 1937, he still received no response. Matters came to a head at the next meeting in September 1937. Crutchley and the other GPO employees were conspicuously absent, and I think that was another strategic move, leaving Hyatt alone to deal with the non-official advisors. At this stage, Beddington had been waiting nearly a year for confirmation when the last minute was going to be used. And it seems very strange now when we look at Bell's picture to have such a disagreement about such a traditional poster, actually. You can kind of see where the post office is coming from in not wanting to use such a design. It doesn't really pack the punch of some of the other selling posters which we saw, or even really communicate the idea that you should post early and avoid doing it at the last minute. The post office employee there looks kind of just as if she's bored and reading a book or something, not actually, having to deal with all of these hordes of people. The problem is, however, that this design seemed to come to encapsulate all of the other designs which have been rejected and not used, and really the hopes of the unofficial advisors to kind of have this noble goal of improving public taste. And also, we should note the fact that it was by Vanessa Bell, who who was Clive Bell's wife, and he was sitting on the committee, so I think it would have been a matter of personal embarrassment to him, really, that her design had been rejected. So following another disagreement at this meeting, the advisors threatened to resign unless they had answers about why the approved designs had not been used. This was what Crutchley wanted, but he was also worried about generating bad publicity. Frustrated, he ordered a confidential investigation into the origins of the group. But his subordinate reported that there appeared to be no official record showing what gave rise to the idea of a poster advisory group. So his snooping had come to nothing, but instead Crutchley wrote to the Director General with a report about the group, specifically elaborating on his decision not to use any of their approved designs. These included designs by Edgar Ainsworth, Frank Dobson, and Clifford and Rosemary Ellis, as well as this design by Edward Borden, and this one by John Farley. And even today, these designs are incredibly modern. I absolutely love the kind of three-tone use here of the lining cut. It was so striking. The use of the white and black there and the orange just, I think, works so well for a poster. It's a shame that it was never actually produced. It's not hard to see, however, why Crutchley was so suspicious of such designs. And in his memorandum to the Director General, he wrote, "Whatever their virtues from the artistic point of view, on which I do not claim more authority any more than that of an ordinary man in the street, I consider most of them unsuitable either for exhibition in post offices or for distribution to schools. I do not boggle at a certain amount of what I believe is called formalism. This is as old as heraldry and is particularly popular among modern decorative artists. I have no objection to an occasional eccentricity in design or an occasional jest, especially in a selling poster or leaflet, which may administer a mild shock, but which undoubtedly stimulates public interest. These have their definite place in the art of advertising." But then he goes on to say that he doesn't feel that the designs satisfy the definition adopted by the group and the kind of remit for posters for the group, which is a bit of a cop-out, to be honest, because the remit was so broad that anything could have met the remit. Instead, I think what Crutchley's saying here is that he doesn't like the designs, they're too daring, he doesn't want to be associated with them, and he wants rid of the advisory group in general. He reports to the Director General that Bell had suggested that the designs be trialled for a year to gauge the public response, but Crutchley wasn't interested. With the Director General's approval, he wrote to Beddington, Clark and Bell in November 1937 with the express purpose of provoking them to resign. And we know this because he wrote to a colleague saying, and I quote, "Our course of action, should this letter not produce the resignations, can be considered later." And this seems kind of like menacing and threatening, doesn't it? I wonder what he would have done if he hadn't got them to resign. So for his trump card then, Crutchley made reference to the disputed Bell design, and I've just put it up again. He says, "As regards the last-minute poster by Mrs. Bell, however much one may admire it as a painting, I'm afraid that it scarcely conveys the message which the post office wishes to convey on the subject of early posting. With great regret, therefore, I must inform you that this also cannot be used." Such a snub was enough to garner Beddington and Bell's resignations. Clark, on the other hand, was more difficult to shake. And Clark's response brings us neatly full circle, because it was in his response to Crutchley's letter that he wrote this quote about raising the public taste, which is where my investigations began. And in this letter, he went on to say, and I'll read some of it out, "Let me make this point quite clear. We do not wish you to have highbrow posters. We are not judging the matter from the point of view of a small clique of aesthetes." I think that's debatable, but from his opinion, anyway. "We're considering your posters from the standard of good modern commercial posters, which come up to this standard. And we are advising you to reject certain posters which fall immensely below it. And in almost every instance, you have done the exact reverse of what we have advised. It looks, therefore, as if there was not much use in our remaining on the committee." At this point, you can imagine Crutchley kind of rubbing his hands together. But then he goes on to say, "But I wish to do anything I can to raise the standard of industrial design. I think it most unfortunate that a national institution like the Post Office should fall below the standard of good commercial work, and I will therefore not resign as long as there is the least chance of my having any influence on the committee. But ultimately, Clark's attempts to hang on came to naught. A few days later, Crutchley wrote to the advisors to officially disband the group. And he said, "The Postmaster General has decided with regret that the difference in opinion as to the method of meeting post office requirements is so wide that it would be mutually embarrassing to ask the postal group, as a group, for further advice." And so ended the Poster Advisory Group. For a few brief years then, it was a pioneering experiment of bringing modernism to the masses via government publicity. Perhaps ahead of its time, perhaps too avant-garde and high-minded for any time, the group nevertheless did succeed in modernising post office posters, and they pioneered the use of photography and montage in posters, as in Edward van Dyck Calfer's series Outposts of Britain, which was sent to schools in 1937. And I think these final posters are really a testament to the achievement of the Poster Advisory Group. The use of photography was still relatively avant-garde during this time, and I love the way he's used different fairly bright colours in order to create this optical illusion of 3D boxes, and again using a very coherent colour scheme to make a very pleasing series. Even more interesting though, I'd like to argue, are those things which remain unseen. The unused posters, for one, many of which actually don't survive, but also the behind-the-scenes wrangling that encapsulates so many of the key aesthetic and cultural fault lines present in interwar Britain. It was a time of extremes, extreme idealistic belief in the utopian power of modern design on the one hand, on the other, extreme dislike and distrust of radical new art. Such debates were very firmly of their time. The war which broke out 18 months later heralded a very different age for poster design, one in which the vital need to communicate quickly and simply made aesthetic disagreements irrelevant. It was then that poster design really came of age, but I hope to have shown that the Poster Advisory Group played an important and overlooked role during its troubled adolescent years.